Have you ever noticed how some people seem to ruin any good thing before it can even begin? They are about to close a deal and suddenly find 1,000 reasons to back out. They are due for a promotion and somehow they argue with their boss days before the decision. Those are the people who always expect the worst. They end up sabotaging even what looked certain. I know this pattern well because I have watched it play out hundreds of times. They say they want success and prosperity, yet an internal mechanism runs 24 hours a day in the opposite direction. What I will map for you in this video is the inner landscape of that mechanism. I will show you how the pattern works, why these people seem to be one step ahead of the world but in the wrong direction, and why any victory they win never lasts. I will also show you the exact moment when their mind can be reprogrammed. There is a critical window. In that window, the program that feeds doubt can be interrupted. Change there alters their relationship with opportunities, money, and success. Listen carefully. If you recognize the voice inside that says it will fail, while the facts say otherwise, you are watching your own mind act as saboteur. You are not powerless. But first you have to see the machine clearly. In the next part 1, we'll take a scalpel to this type of mind. I will describe how they see themselves. I will show how their words about prudence hide a relentless engine of self-destruction. Stay with me. There is a pattern under the posture. You will want to know its anatomy. And that anatomy is the reason nothing sticks for them. That opening scene looks like common sense. A person acts cautious. They claim realism. They tell friends they are just being prudent. But when I look closer, I see a different story. That scene is often the symptom of a deeper operating system. I have learned to read the symptom. It reveals what runs under the surface. When someone reacts to a promotion with dread instead of joy, a particular program is active. When a growing business owner invents obstacles at the moment a big client appears, a rule is running. These people wear a mask of caution. Under the mask lives a logic of prevention that always defaults to loss. This is my diagnosis. They tell a narrative about themselves. It sounds respectable. They call themselves realists. They say they avoid naive hope. They say they prevent pain for themselves and others. In conversation, they use phrases like, "I don't want unrealistic expectations," or "I prefer to stay grounded." These lines make them feel wise and safe. They get applause for being level-headed. But the internal line they repeat privately is different. When they are alone, they whisper stories that justify their avoidance. They tell themselves that any joy will be temporary. They rehearse evidence of betrayal and failure. They collect exceptions as proof that life is fragile. They sleep with that proof beside them. It quiets them. The narrative serves a second function. It shields them from the shame of wanting. If you admit you want something deeply and then lose it, the shame can be unbearable. So they decide not to trust success at all. There are layers to that self-image. On the public layer, they are cautious and principled. On the private layer, they are defensive and mistrustful. On the spiritual or moral layer, they may even adopt a posture of moral purity. I am above material obsession, they tell others. Meanwhile, this moral posture hides a fear that money or success will expose them as unworthy. The purity story preserves identity. It gives dignity to failure. Look at the speeches they make to themselves. They will praise modesty. They will recite principles about not selling out. They will speak of waiting for the right time. These scripts sound admirable. They earn nods at dinner tables. Yet beneath those scripts there is a rehearsed avoidance. The avoidance is not passive. It is active sabotage wearing the costume of prudence. Now watch how they behave when money or opportunity appears. This is where the mask drops. A typical trigger is small. A client calls. A boss mentions a raise in passing. A new account appears in the inbox. Immediately the body tenses. I see the breath shorten. The inner narration starts. If I accept this, I might have to change. If I commit, I might be exposed. That fear organizes the next moves. They begin to search. They look for defect. That search has a bias. It finds what it is looking for. A minor clause in a contract becomes a mountain of risk. A friendly comment from a manager becomes suspicion. The brain has been trained to filter for threats, so it picks threat and disregards balance. Then decision follows feeling. I say decision rather than thinking because the choice is emotional. Anxiety becomes the decision architecture. They make concessions. They postpone. They add impossible conditions. They ask for guarantees that don't exist. Their behavior looks rational from the outside, but it is a rationality forged in the goal of avoiding disappointment rather than creating value. Every action then loops back as evidence. The client walks away. The raise goes to someone else. The cottage business loses momentum. The small savings disappear after an impulsive purchase. Each negative consequence becomes a data point that confirms the original fear. The mind then tightens its hold. The narrative is reinforced. This is how these patterns scale. Doubt breeds doubt. Fear produces evidence of fear. It is elegant in its cruelty. Let me give you concrete scenes. I once watched a man in his 30s named Daniel. He had been offered a senior role after 2 years of exceptional work. He told himself the raise would come with too many responsibilities. He pictured failure. He told the hiring committee he needed more time to decide. In truth, he made himself so small in conversations that the committee lost confidence. The role went to another candidate. Later he told himself, I knew it. I am not ready. The promotion that was almost his left him with a reinforced certainty of inadequacy. That certainty then governed his next 5 years. In another case, Maria, owner of a growing studio, received interest from a distribution partner. She feared scale. She feared being unable to deliver. She introduced demands. She raised the price at the last meeting. She asked for exclusivity clauses that scared the partner away. She later said, it was too good to be true. Her words hid the action that killed the deal. The outcome became proof. These scenes repeat in millions of tiny ways. The common thread? A mind trained to avoid disappointment at all costs. The method is consistent. It is not random. The pattern creates its own reality. The world responds accordingly. I want to describe the daily routine of this person because the routine is the diagnosis. In the morning, the first thought is not gratitude. It is what might go wrong today. Over breakfast, the mind rehearses possible failures. On the commute, it refines them. At work, the person scours emails for negative signals. At home, they keep a mental ledger of past losses. Sleep is restless because the mental program runs on a loop. Life becomes a constant pre-assault posture. Socially, they tend to present as steady. They offer advice about contingency plans. They are the ones friends call when they want to avoid risk. But when it comes to their own stakes, they freeze. They show up for others, but not for themselves. This is not heroism. It is avoidance disguised as virtue. Now consider how they talk about money. They often have moralized language. Money is framed as corrupting or unspiritual. Yet in private, they resent those with wealth. They call them ostentatious or ruthless. This rhetorical move solves a problem. It allows them to remain morally superior while never claiming material reward. If you can convince yourself that money is bad, then your lack of money becomes a moral victory rather than a failure. The internal conflict here is vicious. The part of them that wants abundance is shamed. The part that fears abundance is rewarded with safety. Over time, the part that fears grows stronger. It is trained by repeated small wins of avoidance. Each avoided risk that leads to no harm becomes a reinforcer. The person reads these reinforcers as evidence of wisdom. They never notice the cost of the opportunities not realized. And the cost is tangible. Jobs missed, businesses that stall, savings that evaporate through impulsive buying. Relationships fray. Reputation is undermined by inconsistent commitment. The person begins to feel like life happens to others. They watch colleagues build, raise funds, move cities, marry, grow wealth. They keep saying they are waiting for the right moment. The moment never comes because waiting itself is a decision. At this point, you might see the pattern in someone you know, or you might hear it in your own voice. If so, that recognition is both uncomfortable and valuable. The first step toward change is seeing the recipe that produces the bad outcome. The belief system says, better to avoid a potential loss than to risk a potential gain. That belief turns risk calculus into avoidance calculus. Now I will lay out the details of that belief system. It has four main components. First, an identity statement. They believe they are not the type who gets lucky or gets ahead without hardship. That identity sits quietly but powerfully under every decision. Second, a story about deserving. They feel, often without conscious memory, that good things are for others. Third, a moral script. They equate money with compromise. Fourth, a threat model. They see the world as designed to punish those who expose themselves to success. Each component shapes perception. Identity filters attention. Deserving shapes aspiration. Moral script prevents full engagement. Threat model amplifies doubts into action. Together, these components train a predictable pattern. The pattern is self-fulfilling. I can already hear the pushback. I'm just being careful, someone will say. I hear that a lot. But care and chronic avoidance are different. Care accepts risk with contingency. Chronic avoidance uses contingency as a reason to never act. Care can build a safety net. Avoidance builds a moat that keeps opportunity out. The people who live inside this pattern are experts at rationalizing. They craft explanations that make their inaction sound noble. They can debate you into agreeing that their choices are sensible. That rhetorical skill keeps them safe socially. But social approval won't pay the bills or build a career. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a person who has become a skilled steward of fear. Fear is their currency. They spend it to buy safety. But safety, in their ledger, is not a growth account. It is a trap. In the next section, I will break this group into distinct subtypes. Each subtype wears a different personality mask. Each one sabotages success in a unique way. If you want to find yourself in these patterns, the upcoming portraits will be precise. I will give you the faces and the daily motions. You might recognize more than one. And if you do, that recognition is the doorway to the reinvention that follows. So keep listening. All of these people fit under the same headline. They expect the worst. Yet that headline hides variety. The fear expresses itself differently depending on temperament and life history. To help you recognize what you are dealing with, I sort these expressions into four subtypes. I order them from the most socially acceptable to the most corrosive. You will probably see parts of yourself in more than one. The first subtype I call the catastrophizer. This is the person who turns a small problem into a looming disaster. The catastrophizer lives in worst-case narratives. They read a minor delay as proof that the whole plan will collapse. Their voice is loud with what if. In meetings, they monopolize the talk with potential negatives. They think they are being realistic. In reality, they are priming failure. A day in the life of a catastrophizer feels like an emergency drill. They wake up and imagine the worst email. On the commute, they practice responses to a dozen crises. In a negotiation, they grill the other party on every contingency. At night, they replay every slip as evidence that catastrophe was always inevitable. Publicly, they say they prefer to be prepared. Privately, they are paralyzed by what-ifs. What sits behind that behavior is a belief root. The catastrophizer believes that if something can go wrong, it will. They generalize from rare negative events into a global rule. They tell themselves a story. Things are fragile, and I tend to be the one who pays the price. This belief protects them from the shame of being surprised. If you assume disaster, you can also assume you were wise to spot it. Consequences follow predictably. The catastrophizer kills initiatives through overanalysis. They are the meeting that never decides. Their teams get exhausted. They miss windows. Their finances suffer because they postpone investments until the perfect moment. Their relationships strain under non-committal energy. If you recognize this voice in yourself, here is what it feels like to change. Start with a small promise. Commit to a low-risk experiment for 7 days. Measure the result. This will begin to loosen the catastrophic script. But more on methods later. The second subtype is the distrustful. This person does not believe good things happen fairly. They see offers as traps. They assume there is always a hidden catch. The distrustful person reads generosity as manipulation. They assume motives are bad until proven otherwise. They protect themselves by not trusting. Their day is armored with skepticism. A job offer is read as they must need something. A compliment is a test. When friends celebrate their success, the distrustful finds ways to disqualify it. They will insist that the timing was lucky, or that the person who helped must be expecting a favor. The core belief here is moral. The distrustful holds that advantage comes at a cost. Good outcomes breed obligation or humiliation. So the safest position is to suspect every good thing. This belief can feel ethical. They imagine they are guarding integrity, but the result is isolation from opportunity. Consequences for the distrustful are subtle and social. They avoid partnerships. They refuse mentorship. They create friction in negotiations because they front-load suspicion into every conversation. Over time, people stop approaching them with offers because their response is heavy with distrust. The world mirrors back their caution by withholding its best opportunities. One of the clearest transformations I have seen came from someone in this group named Lena. She had a history of rejecting offers because she imagined hidden motives. At 30, a reputable investor proposed to fund her startup. Her first impulse was to turn him down. She asked for guarantees in a way that signaled no trust. The investor withdrew. After a painful year, she realized the trust reflex had been the real barrier. She made a deliberate choice to test trust. She accepted a much smaller term sheet from a different partner with clear milestones and accountability. The project grew. Trust did not become naive. It became calibrated. The third subtype is the proactive self-saboteur. This one is paradoxical. They actively create the failure they fear. If a promotion is coming, they will become inexplicably late or start a petty feud. If a client is about to sign, they will suddenly demand absurd conditions. The proactive self-saboteur behaves as if it is better to destroy the gift than to risk exposure. Their day reads like a drama of avoidance. They set traps for themselves and fall in them. They interpret any success as a test. They will inevitably fail. The internal motto often sounds like, if they find out I'm not enough, it will be worse. So they preemptively prove the world right. Where does this come from? The belief root is shame. The proactive self-saboteur carries a deep conviction of unworthiness. Success is seen as a threat because it will expose the imposter inside. So the person becomes the agent of their own exposure. Consequences are sharp. Careers are derailed. Long relationships end in sudden self-destructive acts. Financial stability is sacrificed for short bursts of vindication of the inner shame. The pattern is dramatic and also tragically avoidable. I remember a case that is seared in my mind. A man named Raul was weeks away from a major promotion. He was offered a team lead role. He started showing up late. He picked petty fights with colleagues. On the day of the final evaluation, he spilled coffee on his shirt. He later told me he didn't want it, but his actions told the opposite. After losing the role, he said, "I did it to prove I wasn't ready." The paradox was painful. The act confirmed his own negative prophecy. It saved him from facing a deeper question. Did he deserve success? The fourth subtype I call the negative conformist. This person comes already surrendered. They expect failure not because they worry about losing, but because they have decided defeat is their destiny. When a chance arrives, they announce in advance that it will fail. They perform defeat and then confirm it. A day in their life has a tone of resignation. They may take no action at all, or they may act with a half-hearted effort. They tell stories of repeated patterns. They identify with loss as if it were their character. This is not bitterness alone. It is an identity addiction to a role of victim. The root belief is identity-based. The negative conformist says, "I am the sort of person who never gets lucky." That identity organizes choices. If you are a loser, you do not risk, because risk would expose the lie. Sometimes this subtype uses defeat as a way to avoid real responsibility. If you fail because you expected to fail, it creates the same external results: missed opportunities, financial leakage, and spiritual exhaustion. Now we need to look at the psychology beneath the psychology. These forms of fear are not random. They are adaptive responses to early experiences and social learning. A child who experienced unpredictable care becomes a catastrophizer. A person socialized to expect betrayal becomes distrustful. Shame breeds the proactive self-saboteur. Repeated defeat hardens into negative conformity. But labeling origin is not the cure. Understanding origin explains compassion. You can be sharp without cruelty. I have seen people change when they drop blame and take responsibility. Responsibility here means noticing which program is running and choosing differently. Before we move to technique, I will give you two fuller stories of transformation. The first belongs to Anna. She carried the distrustful pattern into a mid-career business partnership that could have saved her company. She had blocked offers for years. When a viable partner showed up, she felt the old reflex. Instead of giving in to suspicion, she decided to act like a scientist. She created a 3-month pilot with clear metrics and exit clauses. She wrote down the fears and tested each assumption. The pilot succeeded. The partnership scaled. The work did not make her naive. It taught her that trust can be structured. This small experiment rewired her default. The second story is about Mark, a proactive self-saboteur. He had wrecked 4 relationships and 2 job offers. The turning point was a collapse. He hit rock bottom and realized his actions had been deliberate. He started a daily practice of noticing the urge that preceded his self-destructive move. He called the urge by name. He delayed action for 10 minutes. Over weeks, the urge lost its power. He practiced a tiny contrary action when the urge rose. He showed up to the meeting early. He let the promotion panel see him prepared. The promotion arrived. The new position felt foreign but manageable. The practices did not erase shame overnight, but they taught him he could act differently. Both cases share 2 features. First, they use small experiments. Second, they treated the mind as a system that can be retrained, not as an enemy to be shamed into submission. That approach is vital. Change does not come from guilt. It comes from practice. If you are listening and already feel resistance, know this. Recognition is the doorway. If you find your reflection in one of these portraits, you are not stuck. Your brain has patterns. Patterns can be rewired with repetition and feedback. In the next part 1, we'll explain the law that links all these subtypes. I call it the law of negative self-fulfillment. It is not mystical. It is mechanical. It describes how belief attracts the reality that matches it. Understanding the law will change how you interpret failure. It will show you why blaming luck is often just avoidance. You will want to know this law because it tells you where to press to stop the pattern. Stay with me. The law is simple and brutal. It explains why the world always replies in the way these minds expect. And once you see it, you cannot unknow it. I have been naming this mechanism in different ways. In private, I call it the law of negative self-fulfillment. It sounds grander than it is. Its power is simple and mechanical. The mind runs a program. The world answers in kind, and the person reads the reply as proof. The loop begins with a quiet belief, not a loud conviction, a whisper, something like, if I let myself want, I will only be humiliated, or good things are temporary and always taken away. That whisper is the seed. It does not look like a threat. It looks like prudence. That is what makes it so dangerous. Belief is not idle. Belief organizes attention. It tells the senses where to look and the feeling centers how to interpret what is seen. If you believe the world punishes exposure, you will scan for snares. You will translate a neutral email into a covert test. You will inflate a minor clause into a fundamental trap. The mind becomes a filter designed to detect betrayal. From this filtered perception come feelings. Anxiety intensifies. The body tightens. Breath shortens. The feeling is not a side effect. It is the engine that drives decisions. Anxiety becomes a decision architecture. In that state, small choices are not neutral. They are defense moves. They are calibrations to avoid shame. Those moves look sensible from the outside. They have reasons. They have contingency language and contract clauses. They have prudent-sounding postponements. Someone watching will call them cautious. Colleagues nod in approval. But the final structural intent of those moves is avoidance, not creation. They are designed to prevent disappointment, not to build possibility. Here is the crucial pivot. Avoidance produces outcomes that reinforce avoidance. When you postpone a decision until perfect certainty, the window often closes. When you demand impossible guarantees, the partner leaves. When you interpret generosity as manipulation, you decline an ally. Each of these results arrives looking like the vindication of the original whisper. I was right, the mind says. Good things don't last. Offers always have a hidden cost. The loop seals itself. There is a technical clarity to this. The sequence is primordial belief, biased attention, anxiety, driven decisions, outcome that confirms belief. Repeat. Over time, the loop tightens. The belief hardens. The person moves from an occasional pattern to a trait. It becomes a default operating system. Now, when people talk about the universe or karma and claim that bad luck follows them, they are often describing this same loop in poetic terms. The universe is not some arbitrary force deciding to punish certain souls. The universe is the mirror that returns what you consistently project. If your projection is calibrated to fear, the reflection will be fear. If your projection is calibrated to scarcity, the mirror will supply scarcity. This is not mystical. It is statistical and behavioral. When you act to avoid outcomes, you change the distribution of outcomes. Think of attention like a radar. If you program the radar to ping only negative signals, you will detect negative signals even where neutral signals exist. You will cross-validate them and build a pattern map of danger. The mind rewards itself for catching the danger because catching danger feels like competence. You survive the cost of shame by creating the smaller cost of missed opportunity. That exchange feels safe in the short term. There is also a language economy at play. When you live in this mode, you learn a vocabulary that justifies avoidance. Phrases like, "I'm just being prudent," or "I don't want to set unrealistic expectations," or "I prefer to stay grounded, do real social work." They provide moral cover. They make your inaction respectable. You don't stop because you are weak. You abstain because you are principled. This rhetorical structure is powerful because it shields the tender part that still wants from exposure. But rhetoric is only camouflage. The real cost is measurable. Jobs that might have launched careers are lost. Businesses that could have scaled fail to keep momentum. Savings evaporate in impulse buys because the mind says, better to spend when you can than to sit on it and worry. Relationships fracture under half commitments and postponed promises. The cost is both external missed income, lost clients, weaker networks, and internal shame, regret, a sense of time stolen. I want to be precise about what I mean by projection. It is not wishful thinking. It is the consistent pattern of expectation you carry into new moments. Expectation shapes interpretation. Interpretation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes result. The result shapes future expectation. It is a self-referencing system with its own inertia. Once it has momentum, it resists change. You may wonder whether there are degrees to this law. There are. The law functions like gravity. Its pull is constant, but its effect depends on mass and distance. Someone with a strong, repeated history of avoidance will experience a heavier pull. Someone who only occasionally defaults to worry will feel it less. But the mechanism works the same way for both. The difference is how quickly outcomes accumulate and how sticky the belief becomes. Another feature, the law is content agnostic. It applies to money, relationships, health, reputation, faith. The specific stories differ, but the structure does not. A person who auto-sabotages in business will often use the same scripts with love and money. The template of suspicion, premature caveat, and self-validating failure migrates across domains. I want to give you The mind runs a legacy program that insists on running in safe mode. It will accept the system's slow response as a feature, not a bug. This mental software has patches, cultural narratives, childhood lessons, small reinforcements that keep it current and protected. The patches are stories like, "I come from a family that values frugality," or "I was taught not to trust flattery," or "If you want to be spiritual, don't chase money." Each story is a rationalization that updates the same avoidance program. There are practical signs you can look for in yourself. Do you shrink the space between an offer and a decision by naming almost infinite contingencies? Do you ask for guarantees that no human can give? Do you volunteer objections in a way that dooms the negotiation? Do you feel a strange relief when a door closes suddenly? Those are not coincidences. They are fingerprints of the law at work. Now, this mechanism is not purely cognitive. It has an emotional economy. Shame sits at the center. For many people, the fear of being revealed as unworthy is worse than the cost of the loss itself. So the mind prefers to preemptively disqualify the good thing. If you can tell yourself you never wanted it, you avoid shame. It is a defensive sacrifice. You cut off the limb to avoid the rot you imagine is under the skin. There is also a social angle. The role of being the realist or the wise avoider can collect social capital. People will applaud your caution in a dinner conversation. That applause is immediate feedback. It turns avoidance into a social reward. That reward helps the pattern persist. So how do we break down this law at an operational level? First, diagnosis. You must identify the consistent belief. Name it in one sentence. Second, map the attention biases. Where does your radar look during an opportunity? Third, test the decision architecture. Ask, are my choices motivated by creating value or by avoiding pain? Finally, create an experiment that flips the motive for a small outcome. I will describe practical experiments later, but know this, the law responds to a different input. If you begin to project neutral curiosity instead of protective dread, the mirror begins to show back more neutral or positive outcomes. The change is small at first. It feels like a slackening of tension. The nervous system learns a new rhythm. The feedback loops shift. Understanding the law does two things. It removes magical thinking about luck, and it restores agency. Once you know the mechanism, you can choose where to apply effort. You cannot control everything, but you can stop running the same program. And when you stop, the world will stop feeding back the consequences of that program. This recognition is also a moral pivot. It moves the conversation from blaming external fate to accepting responsibility for internal software. Responsibility does not mean self-blame. It means noticing what runs unsupervised and deciding whether to leave it in charge. That decision is the doorway to change. You might think of this as a calibration problem. The mind has been miscalibrated toward protection at the expense of creation. Recalibration is possible, but it demands repeated, small tests. It demands that you treat your own predictions as hypotheses, not immutable laws. That shift in posture is where the work begins. If you are following me, you are now seeing the mechanism where before there was only misfortune. The law explains why a life filled with almosts and near misses can look like destiny. It is not destiny. It is a consistent program. Up next, I will show you how that program runs in practice, the loop in motion across career, business, and personal finance. I will show the exact sequence again and again in real scenes, so you can see the pattern not as theory, but as a living thing. That is where the diagnosis turns into a warning. If you keep running it, it will get worse. The next part will make that danger painfully concrete. Stay with me. The cycle is not subtle once you begin to watch for it. It looks like a machine in motion. An opportunity appears. The first response is not joy. It is an internal scan for fault. Then comes a narrative, short, sharp, and rehearsed that explains why the opportunity is dangerous. Then a decision is taken. That decision prioritizes avoidance. And finally, the opportunity is lost or diminished. The loss becomes a data point. The data point fuels the initial belief. The loop closes. Let me walk you through the cycle in 3 familiar theaters: career, business, and personal finance. In each one, the internal script may sound different, but the mechanics are the same. Start with work. Imagine Joao. He has been competent for months. A promotion is on the table. Most people would celebrate. Not Joao. His mind supplies immediate scaffolding for catastrophe. More responsibility means more exposure. Exposure means risk. Risk means possible humiliation. He goes into anticipatory protection mode. He overprepares for the wrong things. He becomes rigid in meetings. He begins to second-guess his own work. That tension leaks into his performance. He becomes less available, more defensive. At the decisive moment, the committee perceives distance and doubt. They choose someone else. Joao uses the outcome as proof. I knew I was not ready. The original belief grows stronger. The loop ticks another revolution. Now watch the loop in business. Maria runs a small creative studio. A large distributor sends an email. They want to scale her product. Her first image is not of revenue charts. It is of failing a big order and being publicly shamed. She drafts clauses that protect her from any possible failure. She hikes prices at the last minute. She asks for exclusivity to guarantee fairness. The distributor sees unpredictability and walks away. Maria feels relief and disappointment at once. She frames the outcome as confirmation. Trusting big partners is dangerous. The protection strategy was, ironically, the action that guaranteed the danger she feared. Personal finance is quieter, but no kinder. Consider Carlos. He manages to save a modest emergency pot for the first time. Instead of feeling stability, a low hum of dread begins. Thoughts arrive. This won't last. Something catastrophic will happen. I won't be able to handle it. Anxiety creates a sense of urgency. He thinks, I should use this to buy what I want now, because who knows? He spends impulsively. The cushion evaporates. The narrative closes. Money never stays with me. Carlos just proved his own prophecy. You see the pattern. The content is variable. The root is constant. The initial filter selects for damage. The emotional energy shifts to prevention. The actions are protective. The outcomes validate the scan. The belief becomes more certain. There are psychological mechanics under this surface. One is confirmation bias. The mind is a pattern machine. It collects evidence that fits the story it already tells. A single negative result is weighted more heavily than multiple neutral or positive ones. The brain's error detection system is asymmetric because it is evolutionarily oriented to avoid loss. But in modern life, this asymmetry can misfire. The system treats occasional losses as signals of structural danger, and it rewires attention accordingly. Another mechanism is behavioral economics at play. Losses loom larger than gains. The psychological pain of losing a potential identity marker, the fear of being exposed as undeserving, outstrips the possible pleasure of a new role. So the brain prioritizes moves that prevent exposure. The paradox is cruel. You avoid the lesser pain and end up causing a larger one. There is also the role of narrative identity. People create stories about who they are. For many of these minds, the story is, I am the cautious one. That story is functional. It explains and makes sense of avoidance. It also protects the inner child who fears humiliation. If identity is wrapped around caution, any change feels like betrayal. People will then act to preserve identity, even at high cost. I want to be clear, this is not mere cowardice. It is a survival strategy that once worked under different conditions. Perhaps in childhood, the safest response was to avoid risk. Those neural circuits remained adaptive in the context of unpredictable caregiving. In adult life, those circuits become maladaptive algorithms. They still aim to protect, but they protect the wrong thing. Let's look closer at decision moments. The person in the loop rarely says, "I will ruin this." The script is framed as prudence. "I need more time to decide. I want to read the contract again. I prefer to maintain principle." These are accurate, respectable moves. They simply make them less attractive. They introduce conditions that are unlikely to be accepted. They escalate small concerns into moral debates. They transform deal-making into doctrinal tests. This is the tactic of the person who wishes to be morally superior to prosperity. By making the terms unpalatable, they protect their identity and maintain distance from what they secretly desire. The social consequences are real. People who habitually screen out generosity lose networks. They become harder to partner with. They send the social signal that collaboration will be expensive emotionally and contractually. Over time, offers stop coming. The world learns their signature. The feedback loop tightens. Now consider the internal economy after each loop. The person experiences a mixed effect: relief, self-justification, a muted sorrow. Relief because a feared exposure was averted. Justification because a narrative explains the action. Sorrow because there was a cost. Those three emotions together are peculiar. They form a reward structure. The relief validates avoidance. The justification preserves identity. The sorrow is quickly reframed as evidence. This triad is the glue of the pattern. How do people begin to see the loop? Recognition often arrives through contrast. They watch others take a risk and succeed. They see a friend build savings and keep it. Or they experience a collapse that is undeniable and painful. For some, the shock is long overdue: an unraveling business, a broken relationship, or a financial emergency that their avoidance strategy could not prevent. At that moment, the pattern becomes visible enough to name. I want to mention two transformations that illuminate possibilities. Lena, who I mentioned earlier, had a long habit of mistrust. She turned down a major investor because she assumed hidden motives. The investor walked. Lena suffered and learned. She then designed a controlled pilot with another partner, with small, testable milestones. The pilot succeeded. The partner scaled the business. Lena had not become naive. She had learned to calibrate trust. Her method was empirical: trust, but test. The change was procedural rather than moral. It rewired the loop by creating alternative evidence. Mark's story is the kind of close call that reads like a manual for recovery. He was a classic proactive self-sabotager. He broke relationships and lost job offers by preemptive self-destruction. The turning point was humiliation and exhaustion. He began a practice of noticing the urge that preceded sabotage. He named the urge. He delayed action for 10 minutes. He took a small contrary step. When the urge rose to sabotage a meeting, he chose to arrive early instead. The tiny action created a new data point. He could act differently. Over months, the habits shifted. The promotion came. The habit remained fragile, but the loop had been interrupted. These transformations share two truths. First, the change is built on tiny experiments. Big declarations rarely stick. Small tests produce new evidence that rewires belief. Second, the method treats the mind as a system to be retrained, not an enemy to be shamed. Shame deepens the loop. Curiosity cracks it. This is practical and bleak at the same time. Practical because you can implement experiments today. Bleak because the loop feels self-protective and it gives you short-term relief. The mind is excellent at preferring small comforts over large unknowns. There is a set of tactics I would recommend when you see the cycle running. 1. Slow the narrative. When the first fearful thought arrives, do nothing for 60 seconds. Notice the impulse. Name it silently. 2. Externalize the prediction. Write it down as a hypothesis, not as a fact. 3. Design a micro-experiment that contradicts the prediction. 4. Measure the result and update the belief. These steps may sound clinical. They are. This is retraining. It is not heroic. It is procedural. The mind responds to repeated, small contradictions of old narratives. Each contradiction weakens the old pattern. Each small success builds a new neural pathway that favors creation over avoidance. If you are listening and you recognize these cycles in your life, know this: recognition is the first radical act. To see the loop is to make it negotiable. But seeing is not enough. The loop will keep running if you only observe. You must act with tiny, purposeful experiments. That is the only reliable way out. In the next section, I am going to show you what happens when the pattern becomes unsustainable. When avoidance accumulates, there is a breaking point. Sometimes it is a slow burn that ends in a career derailment. Sometimes it is a sudden collapse, a relationship shattered, an investor walking, a bankruptcy filing. I will describe that rupture in painful detail, and then show how that rupture can become the first true lever for change. Keep listening. The breaking point arrives in two forms: collapse and awakening. Collapse is explosive. It feels like the world collapsing around you. Awakening is quieter. It feels like a long, sober morning where the smoke clears enough to see the pattern. Both are thresholds. Both demand a decision. You can watch the slow accumulation long before the crash. Missed promotions line up like graves. Clients that might have become anchors fade into anecdotes. Savings that were small comforts become ghost accounts. The person becomes a serial starter. New plans that never finish, half-built resumes, abandoned side projects. That inertia is not neutral. It is the weight of all the avoided choices. At some point the ledger gets heavy. The external world notices. Colleagues stop asking you to lead. Partners stop inviting you to the table. Friends stop suggesting new projects. That withdrawal is itself a signal. It amplifies the internal narrative. I was right all along. When your social world contracts because of your avoidance, the loop gets an extra feedstock. The cost becomes not only financial, but reputational. I will describe a type of collapse that is common and illustrative. A founder with an emerging product faces a scalable offer. Fear lodges at the throat. He delays. He introduces conditions. The partner leaves. The market moves on. Revenue stalls. Debt accumulates. Months later, the same founder stands in the dark, blaming timing and market cruelty. But the market was not cruel. It was responsive. It reacted to the founder's rhythms. The founder's avoidance made the opportunity vanish in front of him. Collapses can also be relational. A partner promises a promotion, a relocation, or shared responsibility. The person hears the promise but expects betrayal. They withdraw. They avoid intimacy in small, corrosive ways. The relationship withers. When the other person leaves, the avoider files the departure as proof that closeness never lasts. The cycle recycles itself. The awakening route often looks messier at first, yet kinder in the long run. A person hits a bottom that is not metaphorical. They lose a client, their account is frozen, or a relationship ends publicly. The shame is sharp and unavoidable. It strips away the decorators of rationalization. In that rawness, a choice appears. Continue to live inside the script or step outside it and observe. That observation is the start of responsibility. I remember watching Anna after the investor rejection I mentioned earlier. The partner had walked, and the company stalled for a year. Anna had a choice. She could have consolidated the story of, "I always knew this would happen." Instead, she did something unusual. She wrote down her fears like a scientist writes hypotheses. She designed a 3-month pilot with a smaller investor. She tracked metrics, wrote the fears beside each metric, and tested each assumption. The pilot worked. The partner scaled. Anna's awakening began not with a revelation, but with disciplined experiments. She reframed trust as a procedure, not a virtue to be granted or withheld. Mark's awakening was different but instructive. He had wrecked relationships and job offers. He reached a point of visible despair. He could read his history as fatalism or as evidence. He chose evidence. He began a practice of noticing the urge to sabotage. He timed it. He delayed impulsive defense by 10 minutes. He replaced the sabotage with a tiny supportive action. The change was not dramatic. It was surgical. Over time, the urges weakened. He reclaimed the chance he had earlier thrown away. The pivot from collapse to growth needs a frame. The right frame is responsibility without shame. Shame deepens the loop. Responsibility loosens it. Responsibility means facing the name that sensation. Pause. Ask a curious question. What is the smallest, non-catastrophic step I can take now? That pause introduces choice into a space that has been running automatic. This is not airy advice. It is operational. When you pause and ask for a micro step, you replace a full shutdown with an experiment. The future you create from experiments is different from the future you create from avoidance. People ask me how long it takes before the system recalibrates. The honest answer is, it depends. Neural habits weaken with contrary experience. The more consistent and repeated the new approach, the faster the rewiring. Small wins compound. A single successful pilot, a single kept appointment, a single saved sum that remains untouched for months. Each of these is evidence that contradicts the old program. Evidence begets confidence. Confidence begets new choices. New choices beget different outcomes. But there is an unpleasant truth in the middle of this process. Old patterns will still have pull. The body will revert under stress. The mind will crave the comfort of the old righteousness. That is why the reprogramming cannot be episodic. It must be a practice, not simply an insight. It must be routinized. You need rituals that default to curiosity instead of fear. At the rupture, you must also choose the company you keep. People who applaud your caution will shore up the old identity. You need partners who will hold you accountable to experiments that test expansion. Accountability is not coercion. It is feedback. It is an external mirror to catch your blind spots. There is another element I want to emphasize: forgiveness without indulgence. When you fail, and you will do not collapse into self-abuse. Do not use failure as fuel for the old story. Instead, treat failure as data. Ask, what precisely in my sequence produced this result? Then test an alternative. The quality of your curiosity determines the quality of your change. You may think that this work will make you naive. I want you to hear something hard. Reprogramming is not naive. It is calibrated. It is a strategy of managed risk. Trust becomes structured. Risk is analyzed. You still hedge. You still keep contingencies. But you stop treating contingency as a moral excuse to never act. Sometimes people will tell you that change requires a miracle. It does not. It requires small, structural changes repeated over time. The miracle is cumulative. It looks like luck from the outside because the noise collapses into signal. The person who once self-sabotaged will seem suddenly steady. But that steadiness is a product of practice. What I often witness after rupture and practice is a different interior posture. The person moves from "I must avoid" to "I will observe." The first is a defensive orientation. The second is a curious one. The curious posture asks questions instead of declaring verdicts. It tolerates uncertainty long enough to gather data. It is the posture of a scientist, not a martyr. Let me close this part with a concrete example of the early protocol I give to people at the rupture point. It is a 3-day micro-audit. Day 1. Notice and record every time you feel the impulse to sabotage or decline an opportunity. Describe the sensation, the thought, and the action you nearly took. Day 2. For each recorded moment, write a 1-line counter-hypothesis and a tiny experiment you can run in the next week. Day 3. Choose the smallest experiment and commit. The aim is not to win big. It is to create evidence that the old expectation is not inviolable. If you complete 3 days honestly, you will have shifted something. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to make the loop a negotiable object rather than an absolute law. Enough to let you see that the world has been reflecting your program, and that by changing the program, you change the reflection. In the next section, I will translate this into a usable ritual you can start today. I will give you language, timing, and the exact phrases to write in your notebook. I will show how to turn the internal pause into an external script. That script is the first tool of reprogramming. If you are ready to move from diagnosis to practice, keep listening. The next part is where change begins to look like a plausible habit. Change begins not with a grand vow, but with a new posture. I say posture because the shift is physical, cognitive, and moral all at once. It is a stance toward uncertainty that replaces the reflex to doom with a neutral curiosity. You do not become naive. You become precise. The first thing I teach people at this stage is to stop arguing with their mind. When the catastrophic thought arrives, you are not wrong to notice it. You are wrong to let it run the meeting, the negotiation, the relationship. So the practice begins with interruption. I instruct them, pause for 60 seconds. Breathe. Name the impulse out loud. Say, there is an urge to protect. That naming collapses some of its power. It turns a verdict into an event. Pause. Name. Breathe. Then write. This is where procedure replaces sermon. I ask for a small notebook and 3 columns. In the left column, write the fearful prediction exactly as it appears. In the middle column, write the immediate evidence for and against. In the right column, write a neutral, testable statement. Not, I will manifest wealth, but I will test this offer over 4 weeks with defined metrics. The ritual is mechanical. It is unsentimental. It produces data. People underestimate what data does to belief. A single chart or a simple week of metrics will outrank a decade of rumor. But the mind will only accept that chart if the person allowed the experiment to run. So I make the experiments tiny, awkwardly small. Do not restructure your life. Schedule a trial. If you fear a client will swallow you, offer a pilot. 1 deliverable, 1 week, 1 payment. If you fear promotion will expose you, ask for a temp project that expands responsibility in 30-day increments. The pilot is both protection and opportunity. I saw this work with Lena. She refused a major investor for months. She had reasons that felt moral and sound. The offer had edges that made her anxious. Her first move, after the collapse, was an ugly retreat to prove she was right. Later she did something different. She negotiated a 60-day pilot with a smaller investor. They agreed on 3 metrics. Lena tracked everything. On day 45, 1 metric beat the target. Her language changed. She stopped needing the moral certainty that had justified avoidance. Pilot success did not eliminate risk. It rewired her tolerance for it. The ritual I give is more than a notebook. It is a daily architecture for attention. Morning practice. Identify 1 pending opportunity that is triggering anxiety. Ask 3 questions and write them down. Question 1. What is the smallest, non-catastrophic experiment I can run this week? Question 2. What evidence would disconfirm my fear? Question 3. If this fails, what will I actually lose and what will I learn? The answers are not speeches. They are tasks. An essential piece is safety rails that do not default to avoidance. If your reflex is to demand impossible guarantees, design guarantees that are reciprocal and time-boxed. For business, that means performance-based milestones rather than absolute protections that scare partners off. For relationships, it means a trial period of increased transparency, not permanent withdrawal. For money, it means a visible lockbox. Allow yourself a small, designated spending envelope and automatically save or invest the rest where it is not easy to touch. Structure trust. Don't make distrust a moral virtue. You will hate this at first. The old system rewards its own continuation. The relief that followed avoidance is a seductive payoff. You remove the immediate anxiety, and your mind handed you a quiet medal of righteousness. So the new practice must offer a competing reward. Micro wins do that. Keep a tiny victories section in the same notebook. Record the smallest contrary evidence. A kept meeting. A pilot delivered. A saved some untouched for 30 days. Over time, this column grows louder. Language matters. I teach specific phrases to use in the moment. Replace "this will fail" with "this is a hypothesis." Replace "I can't trust them" with "I will test the terms." Replace "I knew it" with "here is a data point." These are small linguistic shifts, but they change the logic of decision-making. A hypothesis invites testing. A data point invites revision. A verdict invites collapse. You also need external accountability that does not collude with avoidance. At a year, he accepted a leadership role he had previously destroyed. He did not arrive triumphant. He arrived steady. The loop had been interrupted. We must be clear about failure. You will fail while reprogramming. You will forget the notebook. You will slide into the old righteous relief. When that happens, do not collapse into shame. Practice forgiveness without indulgence. Stop. Inventory the sequence that led you there. Which thought started it? What bodily sensation preceded action? Name it. That is data. Then design the next micro-experiment to contradict the pattern. If shame sits heavy, ask the very small question, what would a curious version of me do right now? Curiosity is the antidote to punitive narratives. Routines will need to be ritualized. I tell people to attach the practice to existing anchors. After your morning coffee, write one micro-note. After lunch, check your tiny experiment. Before bed, log one tiny victory. Rituals reduce friction. They make the new pattern habitual. Habit, more than willpower, determines sustained change. There is an ethical component to this work. Reprogramming is not permission to be reckless. It is a method to take calibrated risk. You still hedge. You still do due diligence. The difference is you do those things to expand possibility, not to manufacture proof of eventual doom. That moral reframe is crucial. It moves you from a posture of self-preservation to one of responsible creation. Finally, understand that the mind is social. The people you keep will either nourish the new circuitry or feed the old one. If your friends praise your caution as virtue, you will stall. Seek partners who will insist you run the experiment. Seek mentors who have a track record of measured risk. Change requires a new ecology, not just a new practice. If you adopt this posture, you will notice an early paradox. Your anxiety does not vanish. It becomes an instrument. You learn to use it as a signal, not as a dictator. The rituals translate fear into tests. And if the tests begin to succeed, the old stories start to lose authority. But this is not magic. It is cumulative work. It requires stubbornness and curiosity. When you are ready to see what those small experiments produce in real life, you will find that the world responds differently. That is where the small, practical horrors of the old script begin to unwind. But before we see the changes, we have to watch the first evidence appear tiny, stubborn, and undeniable. The next part shows what that future looks like in everyday scenes. What I describe there is not theoretical. It is the result of practice. Ready to see how life starts to shift? Keep listening. The future I describe is not a cinematic overnight turnaround. It is a series of small, visible shifts. You will notice them first in the way time opens up around opportunities. Where you once felt constricted, now there is room to test. That feeling alone is instructive. It tells you the mind is willing to tolerate uncertainty. Picture a routine scene. A client emails with an attractive proposal. Before, you would have felt the immediate constriction, anxiety, worst-case scenarios, sabotage scripts. Today you reach for the notebook. You write the fear, question the evidence, and propose a pilot. Then you send a short message. I'd like to run a 30-day pilot with 3 deliverables. The client replies yes. The pilot starts. You deliver one small success. The relationship expands. This is not dramatic, but it is durable. Another moment is a promotion conversation. Previously, it would have triggered preemptive withdrawal, arrive late, pick a fight, create distance. Now you prepare a series of micro-commitments. You ask for a 60-day ramp. You request mentorship on a specific skill. You schedule weekly check-ins. You enter responsibility with structure. The extra scaffolding keeps the old self-sabotage from reasserting. You grow into the role rather than fleeing from it. In money, the difference is brutal. Instead of reacting to the whisper, "It won't last," With impulsive spending, you set an automatic rule. 50% of a bonus goes into an account with a simple barrier: no ATM card, visible goal, and a calendar check at 90 days. You permit a small, guilt-free spending envelope that is explicitly allowed. The envelope quiets the panic. The locked portion accumulates. After 3 months, the balance reads differently and you behave differently around it. These are examples, but the pattern is consistent. You trade high arousal decisions for low arousal experiments. You shorten the feedback loop. Feedback is the teacher. Before, the feedback was an outcome you manufactured by fleeing. Now, the feedback is an empirical result from a constrained test. That changes belief. What shifts internally is less obvious, but more important. You start to notice the urges as physical events. Heat in the chest, pressure behind the eyes, a hardening of posture. Naming them disempowers them. You learn to accept the sensation and do a small contrary action anyway. Over time, the sensation loses its charge. It becomes background noise rather than a command. I want to be specific about timing. Neural habits require repetition. The first 3 months produce small but measurable shifts. The first year produces a new default. I have seen people who practice daily micro-experiments for 9 months report that offers now last longer in their lives. They no longer kill possibilities at the first sign of danger. That longevity is what compounds into prosperity. You will still slip. Stress will resurrect the old program. But the recovery is faster because you now have rituals to insert between urge and action. Where previously you would have acted and then rationalized, you now pause and run an experiment. The pause is the new muscle. Strengthen it. Let me give you 2 scenes that often surprise people because they are so ordinary and so revealing. Scene 1. A relationship that had been on the brink. One partner always expected abandonment and behaved accordingly. They would pull away at the first sign of intimacy, testing the other until the other left. After practicing the micro-experiments, they started asking for small guarantees. Can we agree to 1 honest conversation per week for a month? They framed it not as suspicion, but as an experiment to test patterns. The partner agreed. The weekly conversation created new data. Over months, the pair built a lab of trust. The person who used to run discovered closeness without catastrophe. The relationship did not become perfect, but it became possible. Scene 2. A founder who had lost an investor by escalating demands. He learned to structure trust. Instead of demanding impossible clauses, he designed a deliverable-based agreement with clear milestones. He accepted staged funding tied to performance. The funder watched the first milestone and invested in the second. The company scaled. The founder had not become naive. He had become strategic. He stopped weaponizing fear and started managing risk. Both scenes share the same engine. Trials replace verdicts. Trials create evidence. Evidence changes identity from, I am the one who always loses, to, I am someone who tests and adapts. Identity shifts slowly, but it shifts. Financially, the change is aggregate. A single saved sum that survives 6 months refutes a decade of anecdotes. One successfully delivered pilot brings repeat business. One kept appointment rebuilds a reputation. These are the small compounders of life. They do not replace talent or market conditions. They calibrate the person to make better use of them. You must expect friction. Friends who admired your caution will feel threatened by your experiments. They will call you reckless or accuse you of selling out. That is why the company you keep matters. You will need someone who applauds experiments, not fear. You will need someone who will ask, what did you test? Rather than, are you sure? Curiosity, not judgment, becomes your new mirror. There is also a spiritual contour to this change. I do not mean mysticism. I mean the lived sense that reality is responsive to different inputs. When you constantly project doom, you see it reflected back. When you project testing and responsibility, reality responds with clearer signals. The universe, as I use the word, is a system of cause and effect long enough to produce patterns. You are changing the input. The output shifts. The new pattern is fragile for a time. You will confront situations where the old circuit is stronger: public humiliation, major financial loss, trauma. Those moments can rewind months of practice. Prepare for setbacks. Build redundancy into your rituals. When you are under siege, if you are in it, celebrate the small wins, because they are the currency of transformation. Now ask yourself, how would one micro-experiment look for you this week? Not a sermon, not a grand plan. One small test, one accountability partner, one visible metric. If you can imagine that and commit to 3 weeks, you will have started. If you do not know how to design the test, return to the notebook. Ask the 3 questions. Start there. The next section will pull these changes into a closing frame. It will mirror you back into the story and give you the smallest possible next step you can take right now. That step is not trivial. It is the difference between watching your life and changing it. Are you ready to choose? We began by naming the problem. A mind that expects the worst will engineer the worst. Now we end with the blunt reality and the smallest rescue. I will not moralize. I will mirror. If you have watched this far, answer honestly. Where do you live in the loop right now? Are you the person who protects by withdrawing or the one who preemptively destroys? Are you the moralist who refuses offers on principle or the one who spends the savings to quiet the fear? Name it. Naming is responsibility. Here is the simplest truth. Recognition without action is only observation. Seeing the loop is the first radical act. The second is designing a tiny experiment and running it. The third is measuring what happened and updating your belief. Those 3 moves repeat until the old program softens. That is the work. I will give you one micro step you can do right now. It takes 10 minutes and costs nothing. Step 1. Take a notebook. Step 2. Write the exact catastrophic thought that has been cycling for you this week. Step 3. Write the evidence for and against it in 2 short lines each. Step 4. Design one micro-experiment that would contradict the catastrophic thought in 1 week. Make the experiment so small you cannot talk yourself out of it. Step 5. Send one message to one person that commits you to the experiment. That is it. 10 minutes. A small test. A single accountability move. If you do that now, you have moved from spectator to experimenter. If you do it honestly, you have already changed the physics of your next decision. That small act is the hinge. It breaks the inertia of self-sabotage because inertia depends on inaction. There are 3 things to promise yourself when you run the experiment. Promise 1. No narrative amplification when the outcome is messy. You will treat failure as data. Promise 2. A 24-hour rule of curiosity when the urge to rationalize returns. You will wait 24 hours before drafting a moral verdict. Promise 3. You will log one micro-victory daily. Even if the victory is only, I paused and wrote the test. These promises create a scaffold for repeatable behavior. If you want a phrase to repeat when the old script presses you, use this. This is a hypothesis, not a destiny. Say it aloud. It is short, practical, and true. It moves the mind from verdict to inquiry. Repeat it in meetings, in front of offers, in the middle of the night. Language shifts orientation. You may worry that this makes you softer or naive. It does not. It makes you more effective. It reallocates courage from the theater of avoidance to the laboratory of action. Courage applied as test design is more useful than courage applied as moral posturing. I will not pretend this is quick. Neural habits take time. But the velocity of change is in your hands. Small experiments compound. A pilot here, a locked account there, a kept appointment, and a measured outcome. These accumulate until the world around you responds differently. The quiet irony is that the world felt opposed to you because your behavior had taught it to be. Now the mirror question I ask everyone who listens. Which area will you choose for your first test: career, money, relationship, or health? Pick one. Make the experiment so small you can start it within 48 hours. If you are serious, write it in the comments with your city. If you are committed, tell one person now. Before I close, 3 warnings. First, do not expect perfection. You will revert sometimes. That is normal. Second, do not over-explain your fear to people who applaud your caution. Seek accountability from those who will enforce experiments. Third, measure honestly. The temptation is to massage data to fit old stories. If you want a compact checklist to carry with you, here it is. Notice the urge. Name it. Pause 60 seconds. Write the 3-column note. Design the tiniest experiment. Tell one accountability partner. Run the test. Log the result. Repeat. That list is your new operating system. One final honesty. If you choose to stay in the old loop, your life will continue to mirror that choice. There are always rationalizations that look noble. There are always enemies in the story. But rationalization will not produce new evidence. Only experiments will. If you are still listening, do the 10-minute task now. The knob that changes a life moves in minutes, not in declarations. I am not promising instantaneous miracles. I am promising a clear method. That method is enough. Thank you for staying with this diagnosis. If this landed for you, share one micro step you will take in the next 24 hours in the comments. Tell me the city you live in. If you want to follow the practice, subscribe and return in a week with one micro victory. We will hold the space for the small work. The world favors the practiced. Final short ask. If this message helped, share it, comment your city, and subscribe. One community of experimenters matters more than 1,000 cheerleaders.